Hello, fellow bookworms. Thank you for tuning back into our Abyss Book Club, ABC. We are excited that you could join us today and talk about The Butterfly Garden. I know Brittany is really excited about this book. She recommended it for the book club, and I know we both really enjoyed it. So we are excited to talk to you about it today and also give you the information for our new book for next month. Don't forget to subscribe and like our page. Also, go ahead and give us that 5-star rating. We really want to get it up there and be able to access more people. So if you can go ahead and help us boost our audience, then we would really appreciate it. And today we are going to talk about The Butterfly Garden by Dot Hutchison.
Dot Hutchison is a relatively new author. In the past, she's worked at Boy Scout camps, craft stores, bookstores. She even worked at a Renaissance fair as a human combat chess piece, which is interesting.
Nice career path.
She's known for the Collector series, which The Butterfly Garden is the first novel in that series, and that's the one we're going to be covering today. But there's also 3 more books in that series, and I've read them all, and I think they're all really good. So if you liked this book, you might like her other books too. We'll have links for all of those on our website. She's also known for a young adult book called A Wounded Name. Even though that one's young adult, we both would say that The Butterfly Garden has a lot of issues that are more targeted towards adults. I'd probably rate this one at least PG-13, if not R.
TV 14.
Yeah.
Just to reiterate the synopsis of the book, this one was taken from Amazon. It is, quote, "Near an isolated mansion lies a beautiful garden. In this garden grow luscious flowers, shady trees, and a collection of precious, quote-unquote, butterflies, young women who have been kidnapped and intricately tattooed to resemble their namesakes. Overseeing it all is the gardener, a brutal, twisted man obsessed with capturing and preserving his lovely specimens. When the garden is discovered, a survivor is brought in for questioning. FBI agents Victor Hanoverian and Brandon Eddison are tasked with piecing together one of the most stomach-churning cases of their career, but the girl known as Maya proves to be a puzzle herself. As her story twists and turns, slowly shedding light on life in the butterfly garden, Maya reveals old grudges, new saviors, and horrific tales of a man who'd go to any length to hold beauty captive. But the more she shares, the more the agents have to wonder what she's still hiding." End quote.
So like in our past episodes, we're first going to talk about the book and things we found significant from it, and then we'll go into more how it relates to true crime and different cases that we found. So getting into the book itself, I thought that the description of the garden was really interesting. I think she was really good at developing the scenery and helping you kind of understand the layout of the garden, which sort of evolved as you figured it out with Maya, because first she just knew her room and then the hallways, and then soon she had explored everything, so you kind of came to know it as she did.
And I feel like sometimes when you read a book, some of the scenes may be a little hazy in your image that you have in your mind, but I was very clear on it. I can even see it right now, like the hallways and the rooms and the rock and the cliffs and all that stuff.
Yeah, so I think she was really good at that, and I think that was super important because you're really drawn into the world, and like the garden was the whole world for a lot of these girls for years. And there was a quote that we liked that's, quote, "At night the garden was a place of shadows and moonlight where you could more clearly hear all the illusions that went into making it what it was," end quote. And that really shows you how the girls looked at it versus how the gardener looked at it. Like he genuinely thought that he was preserving specimens, basically. Obviously for the girls it was more of a prison, so that kind of brings together those two perspectives.
I thought bookrags.com did a really good job about pointing out some themes of the book, and they said that the themes were, quote, "the reality of illusions and the limits of beauty," end quote, which I thought was a really nice phrase to kind of sum up those themes, because the gardener was very much in his own little illusion, and the women were forced to lose grip on their thoughts of reality outside of the greenhouse to fit into his illusion.
Yeah, and I think illusions and beauty comes up a lot in this book. Like she mentions, when you're surrounded by so much beauty, it doesn't have as much meaning. And also throughout the book, There's lots of places where Maya kind of says, oh, if you don't look at it too hard, then it's easy to sort of live in that illusion. But if you actually face it, then the illusion starts breaking apart. Just like with Desmond, if he didn't look too hard at it, he believed everything his dad said, and he would learn little bits of it and kind of justify it in his mind. How it was still okay for him to not get help and not call the police when he knew it was wrong. But he lived in an illusion too for a really long time where he didn't want to actually face everything that was happening. Obviously, this book is about trauma, and Maya, who was also known as Inara, faced a lot of trauma in her own life too. She didn't have a good time growing up. Her parents would forget about her. They literally left her at a carnival and abandoned her there. And when they got divorced, they were more fighting over who had to take her instead of who wanted to take her. And then living with her grandmother and coming into contact with a lot of really bad people and running away at 14. Like, she had already faced so much. So that, in combination with obviously her knowing that the garden was a place, like she knew that it existed when she woke up there, it wasn't as big of a trauma because she kind of already had a basis of trauma and she already knew kind of where she was and what to expect. So she faced it a lot better than a lot of the other girls because she had more of that background and the knowledge. And she also was the only one who knew that it was possible to escape, that someone had escaped. So that was probably a little bit more hope for her too, which was, as she said, a really important thing to have enough of, but not too much of. And she had the right amount because she knew what was going on.
That's probably what she held on to and what got her through everything. It's also interesting in the book how the gardener really treated them like butterflies, from tattooing the butterflies on their back to putting them in a greenhouse and preserving them as you would think scientists may preserve certain insects like they do with butterflies. They put them in those boxes. Well, he put the women in boxes. So those kind of connections were very interesting to see Dot Hutchison put together. As for the tattoos on their back, there was a quote that just really struck as kind of heartbreaking from the book that said, quote, "My wings couldn't move and I couldn't fly and I couldn't even cry. All that was left to me was the terror and the agony and the sorrow," end quote. So she had these wings like a butterfly, but her capabilities were much, much more limited. It's very eerie that he wouldn't do anything sexually to the women until he had finished the tattoo, because technically they were his at that point. That's just gross to me. It's just very unsettling and very eerie.
Another theme in the book was identity and how much of it they had to give away and how much they could keep when they were taken, because obviously they weren't allowed to use their old names. They weren't supposed to talk about their old lives. And for a lot of them, it just hurt too much to even do that because they figured that this was their life and that thinking too much about their past lives would just be more pain. And when he gave them the new names, that's what they went by, and they wouldn't say their real names until they were about to be killed at the age of 21, and they would relay their real names to each other, which even in itself was hope that someday that their name would be out there and that their families would know what happened to them. So even that little bit of rebellion, just like saying their name, even though they knew that they were going to die, was an act of hope.
Altogether, this book was really dark and very twisted to think about the gardener and his perspective on things, his son, the mean one and the nice one, the woman who would help cook and take care of the women just because she was so infatuated with the gardener, the oblivious wife. Everything just, it was very twisted and very dark, but somehow Dot Hutchison was still able to reach different emotions within the reader.
Yeah, there was a lot of hope and love, acts of kindness that the girls had for each other, and that even the gardener had for them at some points. Like, he was described as kind and gentle sometimes, even though he was obviously very brutal and twisted in a lot of ways. So it was kind of the duality of who he was and the duality of who the girls were. They were somewhere the line between who they were before and who they had to be to survive in the garden.
I feel like his sons also showed the two sides of the gardener himself. Desmond was that gentle side, and then the aggressive son was more of his anger and his sexual frustration, while Desmond was more caring and nurturing.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I never thought of it that way.
Very introspective sometimes.
I never thought of it that way, but that's exactly right. The two children that he produced were like the two parts of him. That's deep.
I'm a deep gal.
I've read this book twice and I didn't think of that. So
I overall really enjoyed this book. I thought that the reading structure for me was a little off sometimes. Also, it made me cringe, but I feel like that's when stories really hit home, is when they get those certain cringing emotions, or like when you get angry with the characters or sad with the characters. That's when you know that you're reading a good book. And I feel like as I've looked into the details of the book and really analyzed it, that I've actually grown more fond of it.
Yeah, like I said, I've read it twice and it really held up both times. The first time was several years ago and the last time was recently. So I think it really held up in that, and you kind of pick out new parts or can kind of look at things in a different way. So I thought that was really good. And once again, I listened to it on audiobook and you read it regular, right?
Yeah.
So I really liked the audiobook with this one. It was different narrators for the different parts. There was one narrator for when they were interrogating her and talking to her, and then another narrator for when Maya or Inara was going through the story. So that helped kind of break it up too in your mind. And I really liked that.
Obviously, I enjoyed the hardback. I didn't listen to the audio, so it's kind of hard to compare the two as like which one was better. But I feel like with the hardback, I could really visualize certain things and take it at my own pace, which I always enjoy doing. Having that tangible thing in your hands.
Yeah, I like that we consume them different ways so we can really kind of compare them. And once again, if you have Kindle Unlimited, this book and her other 3 books in the series are all free with that, even the audiobooks. So that's how I got it, and well worth it. So if you liked the style of this, the next books don't deal with the butterfly garden, but a lot of the same characters come back. The investigators and Inara and Bliss, all of those characters are kind of reoccurring. They're centered around different crimes, and I think they've all been really good. So definitely recommend.
So now we're going to kind of get into how this relates to true crime, which we have so many connections on how it relates. We actually had to trim out a lot of different examples because it would have been a lot to take in. So we tried to kind of sum it down to 1 or 2 examples per crime-related topic. But the first one occurs a lot, sadly, and it is rape. Rape was a big theme in this book because not only did the gardener rape the women, but so did the older son, Avery. And so we figured we would just throw out some rape and sexual assault statistics that we got from the RAINN website. And they are that approximately every 73 seconds, a person is sexually assaulted. 94% of women who are raped experience symptoms of PTSD during the 2 weeks that follow the encounter. And 33% of women who are raped contemplate suicide, while 13% actually attempt it.
Which is just such horrible statistics that happens way too often. And PTSD is so real for so many people. In the book, they talk about how getting out of the garden was not the end for those girls, that a lot of them would need a lot of help to go back to society, to recover from what they went through, and that suicide was a real concern for the family and friends of the victims. And in real life, that's true as well. The experience doesn't just stop when the event stops. It's sometimes lifelong, and it can really follow people and haunt them. So it's really important to be able to keep that in mind, to look out for each other, and to get help when something like that happens. Another big theme in this book was the gardener's wife, and how she would walk through the sort of outer greenhouse every single day, but was totally oblivious to what was happening, just like really close by to where she was walking.
The other side of the glass.
Yeah. And I thought that was really interesting. We saw some reviews of people that didn't like the book, and that was one of their gripes with it, that the people in it didn't act how they thought that they should. So we kind of pulled a lot of those examples out and showed that this stuff really does happen in real life. So one of them that fit with the oblivious wives theme is Darcy Brudos, who was married to Jerome Brudos, who was a serial killer. She was married to him for 8 years without knowing that he was attacking women and stealing their shoes and underwear.
Boy had a really weird fetish.
Yeah. He would dress in women's clothing as he attacked these women. And Darcy knew that her husband dressed up in drag, but didn't believe that he would hurt anybody, even when women in the area started coming up missing, even when he told her that she was not allowed to enter the garage, which we've talked about as like, if our husbands or anybody was like, oh, you can't go in this room, we'd be like,
You better step aside or you're going down the stairs.
Jerome even brought home the severed breast of a victim, which Darcy saw and still ignored. So she, again, kind of what we talked about, if you don't face the illusion too hard, then it's easier to just not believe it. And if she's telling the truth and she really had no idea what was going on, she was hardcore ignoring that and living in an illusion, because that's pretty direct. When women are going missing in the area and your husband brings home a severed body part, that's rough to get past.
Another big idea of the book was the preservation of bodies. Obviously, the gardener would put these women in resin and store them as a museum. Two big people that we thought of for this example were Ed Gein, who kept trophies and body parts around his home and even used them much like a hunter might, and Jeffrey Dahmer, who was more like the gardener than we even realized until we started really looking into Jeffrey Dahmer.
Yeah, I feel like Dahmer is one of those where you hear the name all the time and it's like always referenced, but I guess I had never really looked super deep into what he had done. And when we started looking into it, it was just like every line was worse than the last.
Exactly. He preserved body parts in acetone at his work in his locker, not to mention that he would work strategically to clean bones for preservation and put them on shelves, such as skulls and different body parts. And we have both worked with animals in that kind of way where you have to do necropsies or clean the bones for scientific research and preservation. And when we were reading the way that he would do this, it was very, very much like how you would do it with an animal, which just really shocked us because he was doing this in his late teens to like 30s, and it just seemed unfathomable. But he preserved them so well that the medical examiner said that dismantling the crime scene was more like dismantling a museum.
That's just so creepy. I can't imagine. Like you said, we've had experience in that process and just how much time it must have taken him to perfect what he was doing, because he didn't have the internet. He didn't have like ways of looking that up necessarily. I mean, I guess there's books, but he was so young. Like, how did he know how to do that? It must have been trial and error. That's all I can think of, which is ugh.
Not to mention that Brittany saw he worked as a chocolate mixer, which was so nauseating. Can you imagine being served by Jeffrey Dahmer? Ugh.
And like you were saying, so many people were served by him or, involved in like what he was doing and didn't even know like who he actually was. That's so scary.
It makes you consider who you come into contact with on a daily basis, like going to the grocery store, going to get fast food, or
barista. Like,
yeah, ugh. You never know.
Obviously, in this book, the gardener works with his son Avery and later Desmond to keep up the garden. And so we looked at other father-son killing duos. And Joseph Callinger was a serial killer that robbed, assaulted, sexually abused, and murdered people. And he didn't do it alone. He was helped by his 12-year-old son. They worked together to charge and tie up individuals before the assaults and sexual abuse and murders. And I just think that's wild that he would use his 12-year-old son. I believe one of his victims was his other son also. So that kind of correlates with the book too, because the two sons were at odds.
Also, part of me when I was reading about his 12-year-old son helping him, I was thinking, maybe the son isn't necessarily at fault, but you hear about other killers like Dahmer who started at such a young age and knew what they were doing, and Richard Kuklinski and Nathaniel Barjona. They all started at ages like Barjona started when he was 5 or 6.
Yeah, I think he was 6 the first time he tried to lure somebody into the woods.
So if Joseph Callinger was to the extent of killing and raping and all of that stuff, his son could have easily been the same way. And maybe he wasn't persuaded or biased to do it. He might have just had it in his blood to do it,
Yeah, and it's kind of similar in the book with that too, because the gardener brought Avery in and really showed him the ropes and did all of that, but Desmond sort of stumbled on it on his own and didn't have the same level of brutality. So, like you said, maybe he just had more of the tendency that he was more violent, or maybe he really was kind of brainwashed and trained into it, and maybe he just looked up to his father so much, just like Desmond in the book, who really just wanted his father's approval. Like, that's the main thing he was after, and he really put that above the lives of all of the girls.
Another idea from the book that can be related back to true crime is Stockholm Syndrome. Of the cook, nurse, and helper of the garden named Lorraine, Merriam-Webster's dictionary definition of Stockholm Syndrome is, quote, the psychological tendency of a hostage to bond with, identify with, or sympathize with his or her captor. This happened to Lorraine. She really fell head over heels for the gardener and wanted to stay there in the garden with him. She wanted to be preserved like the women, and for her to be the one for the gardener, but obviously he was just using her for help around the garden and taking care of the women when he couldn't be there, which aligns a lot with Stockholm Syndrome. It is Stockholm Syndrome.
And he even let her leave the garden to go take the classes to become a nurse, and so she had every opportunity to turn him in, but he was so sure that she was under that spell and she loved him or was so infatuated with him that she never even tried.
Another example of this, a very famous and popular one, is about Patty Hearst. She was kidnapped in 1974 by a guerrilla group, and she was raped and threatened and held captive, blindfolded in a closet, and she was forced to memorize the group's political perspectives. She told the captors, I think about a week or so after being held in a closet, forced to read the group's bylaws and manifestos. She told the captors that she decided to stay and fight for their group, and she even took on the name Tania. She was found 19 months after her abduction, and she was wanted for many crimes at that point that she had committed with the group. She was convicted of bank robbery, but she had also made impromptu explosives, stole cars, and kidnapped and assaulted individuals.
And I don't know if you would necessarily call it Stockholm Syndrome, but in the book, the girls that really tried to please him or kiss up to the gardener to either get favorable treatment, or maybe they really did have Stockholm Syndrome or loved him like Lorraine, but the girls that he would mark with the tattoos on their face to show their kind of devotion, I guess, to him, it's hard to say if that was just going along with it for survival or Stockholm Syndrome itself, or, where the line between those two things are. So that's an interesting thing to think about. Obviously, the overarching theme in the book is the long-term abductions, and there have been quite a few of those, especially in the past 10 years or so, that have come to light. And obviously a big one is the abduction of Amanda Berry, Gina DeJesus, and Michelle Knight. They were kidnapped between 2002 and 2004 and were held until 2013. Each of them was lured away with ruses. Amanda and Gina both knew Ariel Castro's, the abductor's daughter, and so he would say, like, oh, do you need a ride? Oh, you should come back to my house and see my daughter. Like, she wants to see you. You guys can hang out. And then once he got them back to his house, he would chain them up and obviously brutalize them. And these girls were held for about 10 years. Amanda even had a child. Michelle also became pregnant, but he forced miscarriages with her, even though he let Amanda keep her baby. he really kept each of the girls separate and would try to turn them against each other so they wouldn't team up and fight, which is different than in the book where they all really bonded and became friends, and the gardener even encouraged that. So I think in real life situations, it's more beneficial for the kidnapper to turn them against each other so they're not working together. They're more focused on, fighting with each other or not cooperating, and that makes them less likely to turn against their captor. Amanda ended up escaping when he either forgot or just decided not to chain her up one day. She literally busted out the front door and flagged down help, and someone called 911 for her, which is wild. She had literally sat there for years watching TV coverage of her family looking for her. She learned that her mother had died through the news and faced a lot of trauma that way, as well as the trauma she was obviously facing as a captive. So that was pretty horrific for her and all of the girls. Ariel Castro ultimately was charged with 977 counts, and these included 512 counts of kidnapping, 446 counts of rape, 7 counts of gross sexual imposition, 6 felonious assaults, 3 counts of child endangerment, and 2 counts of aggravated murder for the times that he forced a miscarriage on Michelle. And he also had 1 count of possession of criminal tools. He pled guilty to about 930 of these or so, and basically as part of his guilty plea, he forfeited any right to appeal or to profit off of this. He couldn't sell rights to his story. He couldn't write a book and make money off of it. He was just forced to sit in jail. He blamed everything he was doing on his addiction to sex and pornography, and really never took responsibility for it. He always said that he was also a victim of society or things that had happened to him. And he even tried to say that the girls were there of their own volition and things like that. So he was obviously trying anything to shirk responsibility.
A load of bull.
Yeah. On September 3rd of 2013, he killed himself, and for a lot of people, this came as a relief, and for a lot of other people, they felt really kind of gypped that he would never face the consequences for what he had done. There are several really good books on this case. Amanda and Gina wrote a book called Hope, a memoir of survival in Cleveland. Michelle Knight wrote a book called Finding Me, a Decade of Darkness, a Life Reclaimed. And John Glatt wrote The Lost Girls. I've read Amanda and Gina's book, and it was a really, really heavy read, and definitely not one that's for everybody. But if you want to learn a victim's perspective on stuff like that and how incredibly strong Amanda and Gina were and are, how they've really taken back control of their lives, and how Amanda is raising her daughter. I think Amanda is a really incredible person because she fought so hard for her daughter even while she was captive. She said that she would never let Ariel Castro touch her, and that she tried to create a normal life for her daughter. She even homeschooled her in her little room where she was captive, and fought for her to get time outside, and even tried to kind of foster a normal-ish relationship between her daughter and her daughter's father, Ariel Castro. Even in that horrible situation where she was literally chained to the wall, brutally assaulted, and constantly broken down, she still really fought for her daughter, and I think that's pretty amazing. That doesn't have much to do with the book, but I just thought that was worth mentioning.
Yeah, she's a very strong woman. They all were, to be able to put up with this and to go through all that brutality. And if you want to read any of those books, we'll have links for them on our website.
I think another kind of small correlation that you can draw is that a lot of the girls that were kept in the garden in this book had people looking for them, and for Amanda Berry and Gina, their families never gave up looking for them. They would always fight and always hold out hope. But for Michelle, no one was really looking for her. No one had ever reported her missing. So it had to have been hard for her to look at the other girls, and they were allowed to watch TV and stuff. So she knew that no one was looking for her, that she was never mentioned when the other two girls were mentioned. And that had to be such a crushing blow every time. I just can't imagine. And in the book for Maya or Inara, no one was really looking for her either. She was very isolated. She didn't have ties to her family. Her living situation in New York was such that she was basically living with a lot of other sort of misfits. And when one of them disappeared, they just figured they were moving on, or the past caught up to them, or something like that. So she didn't really have that hope like some of the other girls might, that people were out there actively trying to find her. Another long-term abduction story is that of J.C. Lee Dugard. Her parents were divorced. She had a stepfather who she felt very distanced from. She felt like he didn't really like her, and she thought that her mom often sided with her stepdad. So she was she didn't feel a big part of her own family. And she unfortunately crossed paths with Philip Garrido when she was walking to school one day. He jumped out of his car and tased her, threw her in his car, and drove off. And JC's stepfather actually saw this take place and tried to chase after them. He took a bike and tried to get any information from the car, but unfortunately he couldn't. As a parent or a step parent, that I can't imagine anything worse than seeing that unfold and not being able to do anything about it. But Philip Garrido actually had a history of violence, and deviant behavior. In 1972, he had sexually assaulted a 14-year-old, but this never went to trial because the victim didn't want to testify. In 1976, he kidnapped a 25-year-old woman, and he took her to a storage warehouse and broke in and assaulted her for nearly 6 hours. A cop driving by noticed the broken lock on the warehouse and went in to investigate, and this woman ran out pleading for help, and Garrido was obviously promptly arrested. He was diagnosed as a sexual deviant, but later received a quote-unquote normal neurological examination, which I don't know how that's possible, but whatever. He even testified that he masturbated in his car outside of elementary schools. So how you classify that kind of person as normal, I don't know. He was convicted and went to prison, but was released in 1988 on parole. While he was in prison, he met his second wife, who was visiting her uncle in prison, and saw Garrido and fell in love or whatever.
We call those girls prison flamingos. That's our term for them. Prison flamingo.
In June of 1991, when she was 11 years old, JC was kidnapped by Garrido, and his wife actually helped him. His wife actually suggested that he kidnap a girl as a quote-unquote prize, and so they kind of planned it together. JC was held in the backyard of the Garrido's home in a shed. At first she was just chained to the floor, and later she was allowed a bed and kind of more comforts. And in the book, if you remember, the girls each started out in kind of a blank room, and as they had good behavior or did stuff that the gardener deemed beneficial, they would kind of earn comforts and even hobbies and decorations and things like that. Garrido would buy JC pets and things that he showed that he cared, but then he would either take them away, he would kill her pets, and always kept her in fear. He also brainwashed her. He told her that her parents didn't want her, that no one was looking for her. He would never let her watch the news, so she could never see the coverage of her own disappearance. And he would just say that her parents never really liked her, and since she had been kind of distanced from her parents, she believed this. He even gave her a new name, Alyssa, and wouldn't let her say her name or really talk about her old life. So she was also kind of forced to adopt a new persona just to survive. Even though Garrido was on parole, officers never checked into him that hard. They visited his home a couple of times, never looked in the backyard, even when his neighbors saw that there were children in his backyard. JC had actually become pregnant twice while she was captive, once when she was 13 and once when she was 17. So she had 2 children that were kept with her in the shed, sometimes in the house. And even though Garrido was a convicted sexual offender on parole and had supposedly people, looking after him, he was able to carry this out for almost 20 years. Garrido was obviously crazy, and he decided that he wanted to start a church, that God was speaking to him and all this stuff. He basically wanted to start this church, and he would go around advertising it. He even went to the University of California. He went to the FBI. When he went to UC to kind of promote his little cult or religion or whatever, he even took JC and JC's children with him. And she was so brainwashed and so deep into her new persona that she never really tried to do anything. She was even allowed access to the internet, and she never wanted to look up her parents because she said that it hurt too bad and that she just felt like no one was out there really looking for her. Luckily, on one of these trips to promote his religion, an officer kind of caught wind of what was happening and ran his name, saw that he was a sexual offender, saw that he was not supposed to be around children and that he was toting these 2 kids around, and decided to sort of play his game and pretend to be interested in what he was peddling. Finally, she got JC alone and started interrogating her a little bit on who she was, if she was in trouble, things like that. And at first, JC was very agitated. She was super angry. She told them her name was Alyssa. She even told them that she was a battered wife that was on the run and that Garrido was helping her, that he was a great father. And it took them a long time to get her to say her real name, to acknowledge who she was. She showed a lot of signs of Stockholm syndrome, even though she says that she did not have that it was basically just what she needed to do to survive. And it had been, like I said, only almost 20 years. So that's a long time, especially when she was only 11 when she was taken. So she was in captivity at that point almost twice as long as she had been out. There were so many opportunities for law enforcement that they just missed. And in the book, there were a lot of opportunities that the girls tried to take. When the gardeners came to the garden, when Desmond came to the garden, they tried to take all these opportunities to escape, and just none of them panned out and would even get them injured or killed sometimes. So it became known that it was so dangerous to try to escape that they just didn't even try. And I think that can happen with a lot of long-term kidnappings, because to keep yourself safe, and in this case and in Amanda's case, to keep your children safe, you just have to do what you have to do. And especially when there's other people involved, when there's children or other victims, there's just sometimes you can't make the impulsive decision, because that can come back to bite you or the people that you love. And in captivity, it just breaks down your state of mind, I think, a lot. JC also wrote a book about her ordeal, and I've read that as well, and it's an amazing book. Another really hard read, but super incredible. She's a very hopeful and bright person, which is incredible with what she's faced. So we'll have a link to that on our website too, and I really recommend that book as well.
Another theme from the book that relates to true crime in many different cases, even though we're not covering them all, are perpetrators' preference for certain age groups. An example of that is with Steven Stainer. He was abducted at the age of 7 by a man named Kenneth Parnell and held captive 200 miles away from his home until he was the age of 14. He grew out of Kenneth Parnell's desired age group when he hit puberty, and Parnell found a new boy named Timothy White that was back in the age group that he preferred. Steven Stainer did not want the young boy to go through the same things that he had, so he made a promise and a plan to take Timothy back home to his family, which he followed through with. And in the process of returning them, Steven Stainer was discovered and rescued and returned back to his family.
Yeah, so in the garden, the gardener wouldn't take below 16 and would keep them until they were 21. So he had a very specific preference and never wanted to go out of that. And it was Avery who ultimately disregarded that and took the young girl at the end. That really prompted a shift in the garden. Just like Steven Stainer decided that he was going to break out because he didn't want this to happen to another little boy. Inara and the other quote unquote butterflies decided that when Avery took the very, very young girl, that was it, that they weren't going to let anyone touch her, that they were going to protect her. So that really shifted their thinking to protecting someone else, which can sometimes be a more powerful feeling than just self-preservation. Even though I think in a lot of things, self-preservation can kind of take hold, but these are all cases where the concern for somebody else was so much stronger.
And that kind of wraps up our discussion on the butterfly garden. We hope that you guys really enjoyed it. And if you have anything to add about what we've talked about or any cases that you think are really interesting that pertain to the book, then go ahead and shoot us a message. Let us know about it. We would love to look up those cases, review them. Obviously, we look at a lot of true crime information, even if it doesn't pertain to our episodes. So please let us know anything interesting that you know about from the cases we've talked about, or anything interesting about a different case that may pertain to the book, or even just your opinions on the butterfly garden itself.
Yeah, we will start a thread on our private Abyss Facebook group for you to share your thoughts. So you can do that. You can email us. You can comment on our YouTube posting of this episode and really get out your thoughts. I think when we were looking at reviews, I noticed that people either really liked the book or really, really hated it. So I'd be really interested to hear perspectives from both sides. I know there were a lot of reviews that were negative that I didn't agree with, but I think there were some valid criticisms too. So we'd love to hear your thoughts, like she said, and really start a discussion about this book and the cases that are related to it. The next book we will be talking about is The Chalk Man by C.J. Tudor, and that episode will be coming out May 1st. The summary of the book is, quote, in 1986, Eddie and his friends are on the verge of adolescence, spending their days biking in search of adventure. The chalkmen are their secret code, stick figures they draw for one another as a hidden message. But one morning, the friends find a chalkman leading them to the woods. They follow the message only to find the dead body of a teenage girl. In 2016, Eddie is nursing a drinking problem and trying to forget his past until one day he gets a letter containing a chalkman, the same one he and his friends saw when they found the body. Soon, he learns that all his old friends received the same note. When one of them is killed, Eddie realizes that saving himself means figuring out what happened all those years ago, but digging into the past proves more dangerous than he could have known. Because in this town, everyone has secrets, no one is innocent, and some will do anything to bury the truth. End quote. So we're excited to talk to you about that book coming next month. And so we hope that you'll join us for that one and check that book out. We will have a link to it on our website. So be sure to read that and join us next month.
We look forward to talking to you about the book and hearing your feedback.
Thank you for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe and like us on Facebook and follow our Instagram. Give us a 5-star rating, all of that. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks for jumping into the abyss with us again. Bye.
Bye.